Hello. I was just getting ready to finish a letter to my cousin in England. It's so good to see you. My goodness, it's been a long time, many years, in fact, since we've seen each other. I should tell you what's been going on here. I don't think we've spoken since the French and Indian War. Well, when that ended, the British were able to take over some land that belonged to the French. And of course, this caused a problem because it really was Native American land. And the Native Americans got a little upset about having their land taken away. So the British had built Fort Pitt on the frontier and other forts further in, like Fort Detroit. But King George wanted to enforce that no colonists should really be crossing the Appalachian Mountains. So he sent 10,000 troops over to make things quieter on the frontier and try to keep the native people happy, keep the colonists from moving into this new land. Well, that was a little upsetting. I had some friends that had already been living in that area. Were they supposed to leave? This really limited the freedom. It was able to control expansion a little bit, but it really didn't keep people from moving into the frontier. Well, at the end of the war, it was really expensive. England spent so much money, they had to figure out how to make up their debt, what they owed. Do you know how much they owed after the war? A lot. 122 million pounds. And that's the same as 135,308,800,000. Where were they going to get that money? Well, they thought of two things. One was to tighten up the rules on trade. They had gotten a little bit loose and they could be making more money, making sure that things were coming to and from England and not going to other countries and coming from other countries. And, well, they needed to tax the colonists and the citizens in England. If you could tax your people, you can make a little money. So they're going to try to make all of this money back. In taxing the colonists, you can tax the people directly and have them pay a certain amount, or you can tax the things that they buy. So they did a little bit of both. It worked a little bit, but there were still the problems that people figured out how to get goods from other places and from other ships not going through the routes they were supposed to go through. We call that smuggling. So there was a fair amount of smuggling going on so that people could get some goods that they wanted. So in 1763, they created the Writs of Assistance. What this really was it was a general search warrant. This meant that anybody who was accused of being a smuggler could be tried with a royal judge. They knew that smugglers that were tried in the colonies by local judges were usually not considered guilty. So this also allowed the customs officers to search any ships, any shops, any warehouses, or any private home for smuggled goods. They could walk into your house and just look because they were allowed to. This was very upsetting for all of us. In 1764, they lowered the tax on molasses in hoping that maybe people would actually begin to pay the local taxes. And they thought maybe they would stop smuggling as well. Well, the Sugar Act, not only did it lower the tax on molasses, but it allowed officers to seize goods from any of the accused smugglers without going to court. This is extremely upsetting. I thought we were supposed to be innocent until proven guilty. Wasn't there a trial by jury? Why are we not safe in our homes? This was very upsetting. Well, the taxes that they're trying to get from all of us, they didn't really ask a whole lot from the colonists compared to what they asked of the people living in England. In Britain, you were asked to pay 17 pounds in taxes. That is equal to 340 shillings. So the citizens living in England were to pay 340 shillings each. If you were a colonist, like me, we only had to pay 18 shillings. But not all of us are very happy about that. It's because who is making the rules? Great Britain is making these rules. What happened to our local legislatures? Don't they make laws for us? England says they're allowed to do it. So, England was a little curious as to why the colonists were upset about paying so little compared to those who lived in England. They said, "Didn't we save your land for you?" Well, I guess that's true. But you didn't ask us, and it wasn't our legislatures that said you were going to pay the taxes. It was the government back in England. We find that a little upsetting. In 1765, we have the Stamp Act. So now there is a tax on almost all printed materials. Newspapers, wills, playing cards even had to have a stamp. This big wrapper that you see on here is a stamp to show that taxes were paid on this paper. Any kind of legal document, you had to pay a little extra. Well, that's when we started the protests. There's even a group that got started called the Sons of Liberty, and they were really upset about this. They asked for a boycott of English goods, and we support them. So what that means is we refuse to buy the products that are being taxed. We can do without. Now this really hurt. The boycott really hurt the merchants and businesses in England because we really did the boycott well. They were losing so much money because of the colonial boycott that they actually decided to get rid of the Stamp Act. They repealed or took away the Stamp Act in 1766. Yay! But at the same time, they decided to implement the Declaratory Acts. Well, what this said was the British government has the right to tax and to make decision for the British colonies in all cases. So what this means to us is that our colonial legislatures don't make our laws for us. The laws are being made for us back in England. Now, how many people are upset about this? Well, about a third of us are really upset about this. Then another third of us agree with England, like my neighbor next door. She agrees that this is the way things should happen. England has taken care of us. We should pay taxes. She makes the laws and the rules. And then there's about a third of our colonists that they don't really want to get involved, and they don't really care or feel strongly one way or the other. So it's divided about a third, and a third. Well, so now the English government says she can do it all. The next thing that happens is the Townshend Acts. So the old taxes were internal. They were paid on products that are here in the colonies. And the colonists weren't really good at paying those taxes. So this was going to be a tax that would be placed on the products before they even got into the colonies. So this tax was now on imported goods, which is just about everything. It was a tax on glass. It was a tax on tea. It was a tax on paper. Just about everything, even paint. And this tax was paid at the port of entry before the goods went into the colonial shops. Well, you know what we did? I joined the Daughters of Liberty, and we decided to boycott the products. We could do without those goods. We could make our own fabric, and the tea that I like drinking, well, now it's blackberry leaves, but we're doing the right thing. I do miss my tea. Many colonists were getting more upset. In 1768, the protests continued, and soldiers were sent to Boston. They camped in the center of the city, right in the center. They occupied, they took control. They were pretty rude, too. Sometimes they would steal, and they also were taking the jobs that the colonists had had before. This really upset us a lot more in Boston. Well, in one of the protests, things went pretty bad. In 1770, there was an argument outside a building, and people were yelling at the British soldiers and throwing sticks and stones and telling them to go away. Something happened, and one of the British soldiers fired into the crowd, and then a few more fired. Before they got everybody calmed down, 5 colonists had been killed. Paul Revere even made a poster, a broadside, that showed this bloody massacre of innocent people. And boy, did people get even more upset about what England was forcing us to do here in the colonies. So the Townshend Act were repealed, and there were taxes on everything except tea. Okay? So they tried to calm things down a little bit more by removing the taxes that were frustrating people. At this point, a group got together and said, we really need to write some letters to England and tell them what is upsetting us. And so in 1772, the Committee of Correspondence got together and they wrote letters and they brought protesters together. They really needed to show England what was upsetting us. Well, in 1773, England had been losing a lot of money, and one of the main companies, the British East India Company, was really vital to the English economy. What they made for money really helped the English economy. So they were permitted to have almost total control of the tea market in the colonies. Think of it like your favorite drink. It is mine. Well, here in the colonies, we said, we don't want any tax. We know you've repealed the other ones, but we don't want any tax. So we started a new boycott. And that's why my tea isn't really tea right now. What we did, we stopped the ships from unloading. There were ships that came to New York, we turned them around and sent them back. The ones to Philadelphia, turned them around and sent them back. Here in Boston, it was a little different, though. The Boston governor allowed the ship to pull into the dock. But there was a group of men who I mentioned before, the Sons of Liberty. They were so upset with the situation that they dressed up in the middle of the night as Native Americans so that nobody would recognize them. And they got onto the ship on the night of December 16th in 1773, a chilly night, and they broke open 342 chests of tea, crates of tea, and dumped it into the harbor. Ha ha. Well, that didn't go over very well back in England. In 1774, we get the Coercive Acts. Now, we call them the Intolerable Acts. Coercive Acts means forcing somebody to do something. And that's exactly what King George had in mind. He wanted punishment for how we'd been acting. So he decided that all colonies had to let British soldiers live among them. And he closed Boston Harbor. He's closed our harbor until we pay up for the tea that we damaged. Well, this means we don't get any more shipments of goods. We don't get our food. We don't get our supplies. It's been very hard. The good thing is, some other colonies have been helping us and sending us food and supplies because they're supporting what we're doing. They're supporting our boycott. We don't want to pay these taxes. Oh, and another thing, the Quebec Act. They just changed the boundaries and allowed the Canada boundary to go down to the Ohio Valley. In 1774, the colonies got together, just like you see the sign behind me. The colonies needed to join together or we were going to fall apart. We weren't going to be able to defend ourselves. 55 delegates got together representing the Americas in the challenge against British control. There were 12 out of 13 colonies that showed up. The only one we were missing was Georgia. We had representatives of Sam Adams was there, and John Adams, and John Jay. George Washington came from Virginia, as well as Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee. And together they wrote a list of complaints. There were 13 acts that they wanted England to repeal or take away. Meanwhile, while all of this is going on, our colonial militias that have been around for the beginning of when people settled here, they were around to defend the towns, and people used their own weapons and mostly to defend against the natives is the plan. And they would practice drills and things. But things were changing a little bit now. Our colonial militias, excuse me, began to gather and store military supplies. The British soldiers that were in Boston noticed this. They noticed the stockpiling of the powder and the guns, and they reported that. So here's where we are now. In 1755, I'm not drinking tea. We don't have many goods because we still haven't paid back what we owed for dumping the tea into the ocean. But now, what we've just heard is that several thousand British troops have just come to Boston and that there are more on the way. This makes me very nervous. What's going to happen next with all those British soldiers? I hear they're coming to take away all the muskets and the guns and the powder. How will we defend ourselves? It's a very worrisome time right now. I'm sorry to share such bad news with you about what has happened and how hard times have been. But it's the way things are, and we're doing the best we can. Well, the light is getting low here, and I don't want to waste a candle if I don't have to. I hope to see you again sometime soon, and maybe we can catch up a little bit more. I have to go.